Hello, everybody. My name is Morten Keum. I'm director of the Raoul Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law. And I was also for some years member of the UN Committee on Elimination of Racial Discrimination. I'm so pleased that you take this Sunday afternoon that you could have used for other things to join us for the conversation about one of the most pertinent issues that we have on the agenda in the US, in Europe, and I would say almost in all countries on this planet, namely what racism does to people and to societies. It is not by coincidence that the prohibition against racial discrimination cuts across all international human rights instruments, because we have learned up through history how ethnic, racial, religious discrimination profoundly impacts on the dignity of the individual and break social cohesion and security in society. This is so well shown in the film that we have seen just now, Stay Woke. It also shows clearly, the film shows clearly how difficult it is to addressing it, to getting to the roots. Each new generation seems to develop new tools, new approaches. Black Lives Matter, as we have just been introduced to, seized the moment and created a movement, as they said early on in the movie. With the new language, new tools, new approaches, but building on the ground that was paved by past generations, because this goes from generation to generation. With us today, I'm so pleased to have two outstanding experts with deep knowledge and insight into these developments and what is the current situation. We have Aysha Jones, is the founder of Black Lives Matter in Sweden and a disruptor in the fashion and beauty industry. Aysha lectures on issues regarding discrimination, anti-racism, and improving corporate social responsibility by diversity. And with us from the US, we have Irene Molina, who is professor in human geography at the Uppsala University. But currently you are residing in the US. Irene is also a researcher at the Center for Multidisciplinary Studies on Racism, also in Uppsala. Irene is the author of many books and publications on racism, discrimination, gender, and intersectionality. So I cannot think of a better panel that we have in front of us than with Aysha and Irene. So welcome to the two of you. Of course, in the discussion, we would also be very pleased to receive questions and comments from you who are here joining us today. So we will try to include your questions and comments while we go along. So let's get it started. So Aysha, let me start with you. The film and the Black Lives Matter movement take the outset in the situation in the US. Sweden and the US have very different historical backgrounds when it comes to racial discrimination. So what is it that we in Europe and Sweden can learn from the American experience? Over to you, Aysha.
Yes, thank you, and hi everyone, and thank you guys for having me. It's a huge honor. I think that as the film is mentioned, I have to pay a tribute to Patrice Cullors, the founder, or one of the founders of Black Lives Matter. What we can learn from it is something that was made in the film, and that is to not think that racial discrimination or racism or the issues with racism and racial discrimination started in modern time. It didn't start in Ferguson that we saw in the film. Black Lives Matter, the movement, didn't start in Ferguson as the movie kinda implies. Neither did the racial discrimination start in Sweden year 2020 when everything bubbled up. The racial discrimination in Sweden can learn from its own history by not making the same mistakes that we have made as a Swedish nation, which is that we tend to not want to see our own flaws, rather to look at America, or rather to look at England or France or any of the other countries that has a history in racial discrimination. Sweden has a long history of ignoring its own, its own actions within racial discrimination. Sweden may not have been a huge player when it came to the slave trade, but they were a amplifier of it by making sure that the slave owners could keep their slaves by selling the metals that they used, by making sure that slaves could be shipped on Swedish ships. Even up to this day, Sweden as a nation hasn't really dug up its own history. So let us learn from our own history first before we look at the American history. But should we look at the American history, we should make sure that the institutions, both at home and the ones that we have in other countries, both the ones that are governmental owned and the ones that are created by individuals, should amplify the voices of the marginalized people, should make sure that we don't use the marginalized people to be some type of tokens, that make sure that we also see the efforts made by marginalized people to not even, I think that there was, I'm not sure if it was in the film or one of the people from the film that said it outside the film, that said that white people should be happy that Black people does not want revenge, rather that Black people just want equality. I will leave it there.
Thank you very much. No, that's a very nice approach to it. May I just come back on one question to you, Aysha? And do you think that Swedish kids actually learn too little about the past, the slave past? So you don't find it sufficiently elaborated in the Swedish history books?
Definitely, it's there's nowhere to be found in the Swedish history books. There's nowhere to be taught in the Swedish schools, for example. If you want to learn about the real history, then you have to learn it by yourself. You have to find the tools and methods and the people to teach you outside of the Swedish institutions. And that's not how it should be. We definitely, like, I really like that you brought that up, because one thing that needs to be done is that the history needs to be taught the way that it actually happened. And that is something that we don't see in the Swedish schools. Like, there are so many youngsters that are in school, both in university as well as in, is it high school, gymnasium? Yeah, I think it's high school. They tend to reach out to me and say, wow, we don't know these things because no one teaches us these things. And I grew up here, so I can testify to that as well. Like, my first encounter with slavery was the Roots film, and that's crazy. So yeah, more knowledge in schools, and more knowledge in all the institutions, and to politicians and anyone that has like any type of power to change.
Well, I guess there's always a tendency that you sweep the nasty parts of your history under the carpet, and then look at all the bravery and the victories, and that's sort of what creates our national understanding. Irene, you researched racial discrimination, I mean, for very long. Can you enlighten us a little bit, tell us a little bit about what is the nature of it, and who are the groups? I mean, here we have talked very much about the Afro-Swedes and Afro-Americans, but is that the most discriminated against group, or what other dimensions of discrimination do you see?
I mean, I think that, like Aysha, thank you for having me as well. Thank you for inviting me and for organizing this very important event. It's really, it's an important day today, the Day Against Racial Discrimination, but it's also this kind of discussion we should have every single day until racial discrimination is eroded from the Earth's surface. So it's really important. And I think Aysha took up a very important point there. telling the long history, something very shortly about the long history of racial discrimination in Sweden as elsewhere. I think we need to see racial discrimination and racism in general as systemic. I mean, it's a systemic problem. It's a problem embedded. It's an ideology and a technology. You could call it as well, embedded in our societies along the whole world. So it is a global systemic problem, and it is epistemic in the sense that it is a very dominant kind of way of organizing societies along the lines of racism. And of course, Sweden is not an exception. And in many senses, since Aysha also and you, Morten, took up the issue of education and knowledge, Sweden, apart from having been participating in the transatlantic slavery in ways that we don't learn our children, in ways that people normally don't know about, in Sweden, apart from that, Sweden from the end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s has been producing a lot of knowledge, pseudo knowledge, of course, on racism in the Racial Biologic Institute at Uppsala, in Uppsala. That closes very far away from actually in practice after the Second World War. So it still continued to function. So how is that possible? How is that possible that a country that has been trying to kind of represent itself as an anti-racist country, or a country that all humanitarian values are dominating in society, was so active in producing racist knowledge from, with the support, the very broad support from all kind of political parties and societal structures. So Sweden is not an exception. Not only not an exception, it's an important part of racism globally, for many other reasons that we maybe don't have the time to discuss. I mean, for instance, which would be a topic in itself, how white supremacy as an idea, as an ideology, has been kind of spreading off globally in such an effective way that today, at every single kind of corner in the world, you can recognize that white supremacy is well, Sweden and the Nordic countries in general and Northern Europe have been very active in reproducing that kind of ideology. So Sweden is not an exception, and that long history is something that we should keep in mind and of course learn to everybody. And having said that, I wouldn't like to go in to say or to try to identify which groups are more discriminated and which are less discriminated. But I would say that racism, as this complex kind of ideology and phenomena that we're talking about, and as a technology distributing privilege and distributing lack of privilege, distributing oppression as well, and in a sense also distributing death. I mean, we see that now today in COVID, the COVID problematic, that who are the ones dying most, where do they live, who they are. I mean, of course, it shows the kind of complexity of racism, in which, of course, biology, the color of the skin, the color of your hair, the color of your eyes, the ways in which you talk, the name you wear, I mean, but also which religion you pertain to or you confess to, but also even your class position in society and your gender. Your gender is also, kind of intersecting in ways that is very much difficult to say which group. But I would say that if I think of intersectionality that you mentioned in your question, Morten, I would say that of course, if you happen to, kind of represent all these categories that are, object and subject for discrimination, of course, you can be more, kind of expected to feel this discrimination in your flesh and body, okay, and blood. And I would say that, of course, especially discriminated group today in Sweden is Black Muslim women, for instance, because I mean you have all the reasons for discriminate that group of women, and I think we have in research in the research collectivity we have plenty of empirical, results showing that there are groups that are more discriminated at some points or in some parts of the structural, kind of scale. So
I would like to add to that there is one group within most communities that we tend to forget that may be one of the most marginalized people. Irene mentioned the Black Muslim woman, and I would say yes to that at any given day, especially the Black Muslim woman who also wears a hijab, but also the Black Muslim queer woman or the Black Muslim queer person.
Exactly.
The queer community in most marginalized communities tend to be even more marginalized. And I don't speak even enough on it. And for that, I apologize to the entire queer community. But I feel like we, as people in general, don't speak enough on those.
Yeah, I agree. And then, as I said, there are some, I mean, it's also a very kind of contextual reality. For instance, if you look at the Roma population in Sweden, is a historically highly, discriminated group of people. And then if you look at, for instance, the arrival of European migrants, from the European community into Sweden, coming from for instance, Romania, they are so discriminated that they don't even exist. I mean, in the registers, or that you can. It's very difficult to talk about that kind of discrimination. And of course, the most, kind of historical discrimination in Sweden is the discrimination against the owned indigenous minorities, which is the Sami, the Tornedal Finnish, and some other groups. So the Jewish in Sweden had also experienced a lot of discrimination, especially during Second World War and but even afterwards. So I mean, it's difficult to put them in a scale, but there are factors, affecting every group's particular assets for discrimination,
and of course,
at different times and different places.
For any person being discriminated against and being barred from accessing labor market or whatever, wherever it is, housing, restaurants or whatever, it is extremely painful. But it has, and so therefore I totally agree that one should not start sort of grading in a way, because for each person it's grave. But at the same time, I have to say that it always shocked me that there's such a uniform finding in all the surveys across Europe that the Afro-Europeans are the most discriminated against group. That actually, when we look at the discrimination studies, that it has still very much to do with skin color. That they sort of more darker skin complexion people have, the more they're being discriminated. We can see that in a number of studies, how the more white, the less discriminated. And it's really astonishing. I mean, really, first time I really realized that it shocked me quite a bit that we are still there. I would have believed that issues like you raised, Irene, of religion and other issues would sort of come in and in a way take over from the skin color, but the skin color is still the factor. And therefore, I would also like to go back to you, Irene, and ask you, and also Aysha, on coming back to sort of the Black Lives Matter, because if it is sort of the Afro Swedes that, let's say, just for the sake of argument, are the most discriminated against in Europe and in Sweden, what is it then we can take from the Black Lives Matter movement? Are there key takeaways that you say, okay, this is what we want to build, let's say, the next 10 years strategy upon in a Swedish context? What is it? What would you say are the two most important steps to take now?
Well, I would say definitely the first one is organizing. I mean, this is a central question. We need to organize broadly, and that's what I have seen here in California, at least, that BLM is doing, is organizing very broadly and very inclusively also. I mean, if you see in the demonstrations, there are not only Black people going. They have really succeeded in kind of agglutinate other kind of allies in the struggle. So organizing inclusion, I think, is important. And but I would say also that what we have in Sweden is, and in Europe in general, but in Sweden very much in particular, is that we don't even, as Aysha was also saying something like this, we are not even recognizing that there is racial discrimination in Sweden. And so we have a long way to go, and we have to start from that. I mean, in a way, we have to start from scratch, because we need still, although we have huge amounts, and I can tell you, I'm one of the research directors of the only one and first center for multidisciplinary research on racism in Sweden, in Uppsala. And I can tell you that we have huge amounts of research that shows that there is racial discrimination in Sweden. Historical, sociological, philosophical, etc., generated from all parts, all universities in the country. What fantastic researchers in Malmö, in Gothenburg, in Kalmar, in Linköping, Norrköping, Stockholm, Södertörn, you name it, everywhere. So we have knowledge, that we have, but what we have is a political class not kind of open to listen to this research, not open to discuss the issue of racism, not open to even recognize that we have systemic racism in Sweden. And I don't know if you saw the first speech by the recently elected president of the US. I mean, the first thing they talk about, I'm not saying that we live in paradise here, but I mean, there is a lot of racial discrimination. But if you see the president talking about systemic racism, that we need to do something against systemic racism. Yeah. And I said, my God, when are we going to listen to that from our prime minister in Sweden? I mean, we have systemic racism, it's a problem, and we need to
no, that was it. That was a very powerful speech. Aysha?
Yes, I would say that accountability is something that is very, very difficult, but something that is very, very beautiful. We need to hold nations and people accountable for their actions, for their part in history, and that's the only way that we can move forward. So there is no way forward unless we hold Sweden accountable for their role in systematical racism, in the slave trade, in race discrimination. Accountability is the first thing that we need. Irene just mentioned America's president actually standing up and saying that America has a huge issue with structural racism. That has never happened in Sweden. 2021, and we are still waiting for acknowledgement. We are still waiting for accountability. So that is the first thing that is needed. Once that has been made, then we can start talking about uniting against these issues and how to move forward. Moving forward, we need to demolish all types of institutions and corporations and laws, whatever you may have. Those need to be demolished if they are not working as they should. We need to look at institutions that are set to be here to protect and serve mankind that are not doing so. We need to look at institutions that are here to make sure that we have our welfare intact, that is now being sold to the highest bidder. We need to look at how come Irene actually touched upon that with COVID. How come when there was only people from my areas, Tensta, Rinkeby, like the suburbs, or if you made the ghettos of Sweden, when we were the ones dying, nobody cared. But as soon as someone who was white and privileged died, that's the time that the Swedish nation started caring about COVID. That's the time that they started taking actions against it. We need to look at those factors of why, and we need to value the people, because most of the people that lives in my areas are the people that move Sweden, are the people that make sure that things run smoothly, that we have people in the hospital, that someone is taking care of your granny or your neighbor, or that someone drives your bus so that you can go to work. So we need to make sure that we also honor the people that are actually building this nation.
Yeah. No, thank you very much, and also for bringing in the structural discrimination. It's actually one of the first questions that we got here was exactly on structural discrimination. Thanks to the person who asked that question, and also asking sort of what can we do to eliminate it. And I think Aysha, you touched a bit on it, sort of I guess identifying more specifically where is it? I mean, it's very easy to say structural discrimination, but we try to identify the different areas. And I don't know if you want to say a bit more on that.
Yes, I would like to say that we actually already have identified it. There are so many great scholars in Sweden that has done this work. The only problem is that we are not using the work. I myself, I am allergic of people asking me for research or asking me for, how to say, the groundwork, but then the groundwork is not used. We have Länsstyrelsen that did their report. We have so many people. Irene has done wonderful work on this. We have some of the people in your own institution that has also given us a lot of, how to say, research that has already targeted where the issues are. We know that there are issues within healthcare. We know that there are issues within school. We know that there are issues within housing. We know that there are issues when it comes to work. We know all of these things, but we are still here discussing the same things instead of acting upon it. What are we going to do with all of this research? When are we going to implement it? When are we going to make use of it? Because I don't want to sit here and God forbid, let me die today. And I know that my kids have the opportunities to live a wonderful life with all of the research that has been made, but we didn't do it. Not that we can't, we can. Sweden is one of the best countries in the world. I'm proud to say that in many ways, but we are very, how to say in English, tafatta. What is that?
Yeah.
I don't know what the name is in English, but we are so. I don't even know how to translate it.
Is the English word complacency?
Yeah, maybe.
That's sort of everything is fine.
Yeah, it's like, no, Hakuna Matata. That's only in Disney. That's only in Disney. Let's get to work.
Do you believe, any of you, that the COVID crisis can now contribute to move the agenda on this? That we have sort of, it has been shown to us, it has been illustrated in so many, I mean, powerful ways. I mean, you already touched upon the issue of the helsevården, the health system, and where we see the frontline staff, which are very often ethnic minorities and others, being those who also in death tolls being hit the hardest, and so forth. So there are so many elements now that have shown it to us that there is an issue. Do you think that we can create a momentum, Irene?
Yeah, it should be that way. I think that, as Aysha also said, I mean, COVID is showing it so openly. What discrimination is about. It's about death. It's about poverty. It's about, kind of being the first ones dying when a crisis Okay, so it's kind of being on the front line for everything, but it should be that way. But I'm really worried about that, because what was one of the main explanations when the media started to reveal, you know, that what the situation was in Järvafältet, that the first reaction from officials in Sweden was that, oh, this is it, the immigrants, blaming the immigrant again. I mean, blaming the immigrants, blaming Black people, blaming Somalis in the first place. I mean, that is really problematic. I mean, it's really worrying, because you are showing, you know, kind of evidence of what is happening. And the old and very kind of trashy explanation of racism, as has always been, is they are a problem because they don't want to integrate, they don't want to you know, to follow the rules of the country. I mean, everything is always the migrants' responsibility. So I think one word that Aysha took up, it's so central to understand why in Sweden we cannot go further in the struggles against racism, racial discrimination, is that of accountability. I mean, it's a great word, Aysha. I mean, I'm so glad that you brought it up, because it's exactly what it is. I mean, unless authorities, politicians, you know, decision makers in this country doesn't acknowledge their part, their responsibility, their kind of potential possibility of changing things, I mean, we're not going to move that faster. And I think that I want to say again, I mean, I think everybody agrees with me on that organization is still very much necessary, because we need to go on kind of screaming, you know, and trying to get the attention to all these issues, trying to get the attention from politicians. But we need to move forward also from the grassroots, from the you know, local organizations or more global organizations, and to get together and to organize. I mean, in order to you know, at last hopefully start a real dialogue with decision makers.
We're getting some very good questions here. So if you don't mind, I would like to move on, and because there are in particular two questions that I would like to merge in a way into one question to you, and maybe I say you can start. I mean, and that is sort of the barriers for actually moving on, as you pointed. One thing is that we have the movement, we have the organization, but there are other barriers, and one of them, and there are two issues here that are brought up in the questions. The one is, do we know enough? The census regulation in Sweden make it very difficult to actually get sufficient data on how the particular ethnic minorities are doing. The UK, for example, it's much easier. So therefore, they have much more targeted policies in the UK on some of these issues, simply because they know better. Where in Sweden, we shy away from doing ethnic, of course, registration, but also even into the survey level. So is that sort of one element that we should try to, that we should look into, so we get more knowledge in relation to the specific group? Then another question is about the language that we use, that we sort of use the language of Black. We have done that here as well for the past 30 minutes. And when the person asking the question said, but the problem to just a color, reducing the problem to just a color, when we know that the problem is deeper than that, are we sort of simplifying it? So basically my question to you is, I mean, first of all, do we know enough, and are we simplifying it, the discussion?
I would say that, do we know enough? Yes and no. We definitely need to stop shying away from using words such as race. We definitely need to understand that race data, I think it is in English, could be of use when it comes to eliminating racial discrimination. I would like to say, and maybe people will not agree with me, but there is already race data done by the police, but it is done to keep us even more marginalized. It is done to keep us even more at harm's way. It is not done in a way that could actually benefit us. And I think that one of the reasons to why Sweden don't want to implement race data is because they know what type of data would come up. They know that that would be terrifying for the PR campaign that Sweden has put on for so many years. Race data is maybe one of the best ways for us to eliminate racial discrimination as such. So yes, we do know enough, as in, do we know the history? Yes, we know the history. How to say, like, gemene hen, what is that? Like, a normal person might not have those knowledge, but the ones in power does have that knowledge. And we definitely could learn more with race data. Are we reducing the problem to just a color? No. Due to the skin tone that I have, people have been enslaved. Due to the skin color that I have, people are still being enslaved. Due to the skin color that I have, people are still suffering. People are dying on the streets. People are caught in a system that is constantly breaking them down. People are not getting their wages met. People are not getting housing. People are not getting the proper education that they need. People are not getting the recognition that they should have due to the skin color. So I don't think that that is reducing anything. That is putting how, wow, what is that in English? My English tends to fail me when I get upset, but no, that is, we have to speak about color. We have to speak about skin tone, because that's from where everything comes.
Irene?
Yeah, that's correct, and I think that I think as Aysha, that we know enough for starting this work at last. I mean, we need to do that, but we will never know enough. You know, as long as racial discrimination still exists, it still is a problem in society. So of course we need the generation of new knowledge. I would say that the new knowledge that we mostly need today is knowledge about what are the mechanisms generating racial discrimination. We know about racial. We can generate, you know, amazing, you know, kind of very sophisticated studies with the data we have already. We can do another, you know, kind of registering of data, but I wouldn't say that it is necessary. Sweden has one of the most sophisticated databases following individuals, you know, a long time. So we can follow an individual's life, you know, span today, more or less, and saying what the you know, the patterns of discriminations have been following that person or that group of people or that community or that, you know, kind of a residential area. That we can do today with the Swedish data. The problem is that we don't know in as much about we don't know about the mechanism generating racism. I think every single person experiencing discrimination know much more about the mechanisms about discrimination that we can talk as researchers about. So we need to start. So I mean, my first worry is not the quantitative data we can collect. I mean, that we have to generate the consciousness about racial discriminations as a systemic, endemic, institutional, structural problem, and start from that to understand how racism is generated at every particular place and every particular moment of time, so we can start the real work to counteract it. And the problem is that we have authorities that are not interested on this. So regardless what kind of data we can provide these authorities with, I mean, until the day that they really start to think, you know, that racism is a problem, and it's a Swedish problem, it's an European problem, it's a global problem, that Sweden is not an exception, and by the contrary, is one of the most problematic societies in the world. So until that moment, what we need is still, kind of trying to make that kind of consciousness and well, to generate the kind of studies that we are doing with the research we have still. I agree completely on that. There is a total kind of a rejection of talking about race and talking about racism. Talking about race is important, not because race is something that should, order society. The problem is that race is the imagination that has created racism and has created, this or the racial discrimination patterns. Racism is more central. But in 2014 in Sweden, we eliminated the use of the word race from the legislation, from the official language in Sweden. It's not present. So we have a law apparatus that is not working at all, because you cannot even accuse anybody of racial discrimination because there is no race in Sweden. So starting from that, we have a very big problem in what we are talking about. Are we talking about racial discrimination? Are we talking about every other kind of discrimination, which is important, but it's not covering racial discrimination. Our legislation is not covering racial discrimination.
I'm conscious about time, and I have one final question, and that will also be your possibility to have a short exit statement, if you wish. And it's again coming out of a very good question that we received, and sort of we mentioned Biden earlier, and the person who asked the question say, well, Biden, he needed that group, those persons for his election, so he spoke into that. Are we in a somewhat opposite situation in Sweden and also in other European countries, that it becomes increasingly difficult for politicians to raise these issues? So basically my question would be with that backdrop, in a way, is are you hopeful? Do you think, Aysha, you spoke about your children, will they do better? Are you hopeful that this will change in the time to come? Are you hopeful that Swedish politicians will be more firm in addressing structural racism and some of these issues, or will they more tend to shy away? Or will we see a polarization, so some speak, so say, in favor, and others will be more dramatically against? Very short, 1 minute to each of you.
Okay, shall I start? So Aysha, you get the last word. Yeah, no, I agree with that comment, and I agree it's absolutely on that. The situation, the political situation in the US is what it's explaining. Actually, we haven't really moved. The people here hasn't really moved, forward that in that important way as words are trying to give the impression of. So that is correct, I think. But I'm quite hopeful on the more on the global, state of the arts. I think we are moving forward because BLM has become a global movement, and I think that is really important. It's not only BLM. We are communicating as scholars. We are communicating as activists. We are communicating, very much more today than we did for 100 years ago. So I think that is what gives me hope, and hope is the last thing we have to lose. But regarding in particular Swedish politicians, I wouldn't say that I'm not hopeful. Actually, I think we need to struggle very hard from all the kind of the grassroots levels, because our politicians, unfortunately, are incredibly stubborn and kind of deaf to get in what is happening and what we need to do.
So it has to come from somewhere.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much.
Aysha?
I think that Irene said it all. There's nothing more for me to add there. I'm not hopeful at all. I think that I will die without seeing any real changes. Unfortunately, I think that my kids will die without seeing any real changes. I hope that their kids will see some changes, but I'm not that hopeful, to be honest. This is an issue that we have had for more than 600 years. And I don't think that this is an issue that is going to be solved, even though I see a lot of movement being made by BLM and by other grassroots organizations around the world. as Irene said, our politicians are too stubborn. And I would like to say that it is not only in Sweden that they are stubborn. In Sweden, they are stubborn, and unfortunately, I will also say that they are stupid. They are stupid because they think that this is an issue that doesn't happen in Sweden. And for that, they are ignorant. So I think that Sweden will be one of the last countries to implement any real changes. But when it comes to, on a global perspective, as Irene said, I look more to the African continent. I think that that's where we are going to see change. We are going to see change in the way that Africans as a nation sees themselves, values their lands, values their knowledge, values their history, and values their narrative. And that's where change is going to come from. I don't think that we will see change from any of the European countries, because we still have some European countries that are taking colonial taxes from African countries. How is that? I thought that we abandoned slavery. I thought that we abandoned colonial racism. How come they are still collecting tax? So I have little to no hope in the European or Western countries, and I look to the countries of Africa. I look to some of the countries of Asia as well, but I do not look to Europe, and I do not look to the Western countries for any type of change.
Thank you very much, Aysha, to you as well. I think it has been an enormously rich exchange we have had here that could go on for long. I mean, I have so many questions from all of you still on my list, and I have twice as many in my own head that I would have liked to have raised, but there would be other possibilities. I've heard here issues of accountability, recognition that there is an issue, and without a recognition of that, very little will move. Mobilization, I heard very much the bottom-up approach, less believe in politicians moving the big agenda, but rather being sort of say getting a mobilization from bottom up, and also a little bit of hope, but not too much hope. I counted Aysha as I think it was 3 generations down, maybe, but also some hope for Africa that I must say I share. I think there are a lot of very interesting developments in Africa right now. So, or I've been for some time. So. Really interesting. Thank you very much, Irene, and thank you very much, Aysha, for the contributions and all your really you're sharing your insight and deep knowledge on this. And thanks to all of you who followed us for the past 45 minutes and your good questions that we couldn't take them all, but we had a good handful. So have a nice afternoon, and we will hopefully meet out there. Keep on pushing this agenda. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.